Inside Attica, secrets buried behind prison walls. The hidden files. The name Attica has always carried a certain weight. For some, it's just another prison in upstate New York, a facility tucked away in the quiet countryside where steel fences rise higher than the trees. But for those who know the truth, Attica is not just a prison. It's a scar on America's conscience, a place where men lost not only their lives but also their humanity. Most people only know one story about Attica, the bloody uprising of 1971, when more than 1,000 inmates rose up against their keepers, seizing hostages and demanding basic rights. That story made headlines around the world. But behind the riots, behind the screams and the gunfire, lay something far more disturbing, something the state has spent decades trying to bury. It begins not in the yard but in the archives. The whisper of files. In the early 1990s, two investigative journalists stumbled across boxes of old documents stored in the basement of a government building in Albany. Dusty yellowing pages. Faded ink. Stamps marked classified in bold red. At first, the files looked routine. Disciplinary reports, medical charts, transfer records. But then came the anomalies. Prisoners listed as transferred to other facilities, yet no record of arrival. Dozens of names. Men who simply vanished into paperwork. The dates matched the years after the 1971 uprising. Then there were the medical logs. Records of inmates being subjected to behavioral analysis sessions, neurological stress testing, and pharmacological evaluations. Cold, clinical terms that masked something sinister. Many sessions were held in what was described only as Corridor D. There was no map reference for Corridor D. No architectural plan showed it. It existed only in those files. Testimonies from the forgotten. The deeper the journalists dug, the more horrifying the picture became. They began tracking down former inmates who had served time in Attica during the 1970s. Most refused to talk. Some laughed bitterly and hung up. Others, after long silences, whispered fragments of stories that sent chills down their spines. One man, a wiry old figure named Calvin Turner, finally broke his silence in a taped interview. His hands trembled as he spoke, eyes darting toward the door as though someone might be listening. "They called it the Blue Room," he said, his voice cracking. "Down past the main blocks. You didn't go there unless you were chosen. And if you were chosen, you never came back the same. Some men, they didn't come back at all." Turner described being led, blindfolded, through a series of corridors until he was strapped to a metal chair under blinding lights. Needles. Strange fluids forced into his veins. Men in white coats watching, taking notes, while guards stood silent. He remembered the sensation of burning in his head, his thoughts racing uncontrollably. He remembered screaming until his voice collapsed into silence. And then he remembered nothing. "When I woke up," he whispered, "it was like days had passed. They told me it was only hours, but I knew it wasn't. My hair had grown. My face was different. Something was missing inside me." The journalists pressed him, but Turner refused to say more. At the end of the interview, he muttered words that would haunt them for years. "Don't look at the riots if you want to know what Attica was. Look at what they hid underneath. A prison with two faces." Attica was built to be imposing, and it succeeded. Towering walls, barbed wire curling like snakes under the sun, armed guards perched high above with rifles that could end a man's life in a heartbeat. To the outside world, it was a fortress of order. But to those trapped within, it was a world of contradictions. There were the official routines, roll calls, work shifts, chow hall. But beneath the surface lived an ecosystem of pain and control. Guards who beat men into silence, inmates who formed gangs for survival, and a medical system that often seemed less about healing and more about experimentation. Rumors swirled constantly. Stories of men taken from their cells at night, never to be seen again. The faint hum of generators in places that should have been empty. Locked doors at the end of hallways that supposedly led nowhere. Every inmate heard the whispers, but nobody spoke of them aloud. It wasn't just fear of the guards, it was something deeper, almost supernatural in its weight. As if Attica itself was alive, and speaking about its secrets meant being swallowed whole by them. The corridor. The most disturbing details always led back to one place, the hidden corridor. Former guards denied its existence, but survivors swore it was real. It wasn't part of the main prison blueprint. It was a service passage sealed off decades earlier, later repurposed into something else. Something darker. One former inmate, interviewed under anonymity, recalled sneaking a glance inside when a guard left the door ajar. "It looked like a laboratory," he said. "Concrete walls, yes, but with lights rigged up, chains on the ceiling, and medical equipment I'd never seen before. The air smelled like chemicals and rust. I saw stains on the floor. I knew they weren't from rust. That image matched perfectly with the grainy CCTV footage later uncovered, shadowy frames of cracked walls, rusted chains, and dark patches crawling across the floor like scars. And yet, despite testimonies, despite records, the state insisted it was all myth. Attica was violent, yes, officials said, but conspiracy theories about secret corridors are nothing more than prison folklore. But the file said otherwise. A trail of names. One page from the classified files listed names under the heading Project Meridian. Each name had a date of transfer. Each date ended with the same notation, Corridor D. No transfer destination. No return date. Just Corridor D. Families of the inmates never received explanations. Mothers were told their sons had been moved. Wives were told letters would no longer be delivered. In truth, their loved ones had vanished into a void. The journalists began contacting these families. Every story was the same. A loved one transferred, then silence. Phone calls unanswered, letters returned, visits denied. In each case, the official record showed the inmate alive, but no one ever saw them again. One mother clutched a letter her son had written just days before he disappeared. It said, "They're moving some of us to a place they call Corridor D. I don't know what it is, but men don't come back. If you don't hear from me again, know that I love you." That was the last letter she ever received. Seeds of a revelation. By now, the journalists were convinced they had uncovered something explosive. But they didn't realize just how deep it went. The files hinted at partnerships with outside institutions, universities, even corporations. Contracts for behavioral research. Payments made to the Department of Corrections for volunteer subjects. Except the subjects were never volunteers. They were inmates. Poor men, mostly black and Latino, who had no families powerful enough to fight for them. Forgotten men whose suffering could be erased with the stroke of a bureaucrat's pen. And buried in those files was a chilling line, handwritten in the margin of a report. Riot provided excellent cover, continue corridor studies discreetly. The journalists stared at it in silence. The riot that had horrified America, the massacre that left 43 men dead, was it also used as camouflage? A bloody distraction to hide what was really happening in Attica's bowels? The spark. This revelation changed everything. The story of Attica was no longer just about brutality in the yard or the massacre of hostages. It was about something hidden, something systematic. A machine of secrecy grinding away beneath the surface. And at the heart of it all was the corridor. Every testimony, every document, every whisper pointed back to that same locked door with its rusted hinges and its stained concrete floor. It was more than a room. It was a vault of pain. As one survivor put it bluntly, Attica wasn't just a prison. It was a place where they experimented with what it means to break a man. The final words of Chapter 1. By the time the journalists published their findings, they had only scratched the surface. Their article ended with a haunting sentence. If Attica's walls could speak, they would scream. But the files hinted that the real horror was still hidden. That somewhere behind the official story of riots and rebellion, Attica's darkest secret remained sealed behind that door. And what lay behind it would shake America to its core. The corridor of silence. The journalists thought they had uncovered the worst when they stumbled upon names marked Corridor D. But the deeper they dug, the more the truth revealed itself like a slow bleed through concrete, dark, relentless, and impossible to clean away. The paper trail. The documents were not just routine files. They were a labyrinth of coded language, vague descriptions, and deliberate misdirection. Phrases like extended observation, behavioral recalibration, and controlled deprivation repeated throughout. At first, the journalists assumed these were just bureaucratic terms for solitary confinement. But then they found logs of sessions lasting 12, 18, sometimes 24 hours. Notes on physiological breakdown. Diagrams of brain waves. Even lists of chemical compounds administered to inmates under the heading dose testing. None of this belonged in a correctional facility. This wasn't discipline, it was experimentation. And always the location was the same, Corridor D. Testimony of a guard. Most officers they approached denied everything, calling it inmate folklore. But one man, long retired and dying of lung disease, agreed to talk on the condition his name was never published. His voice was gravelly, strained, but steady. "You don't understand," he said, staring at the floor. "Attica wasn't just a prison. It was a project. The Blue Corridor, that's what we called it. It wasn't on the map. Officially it didn't exist. But every guard knew. Some of us had to escort men there. He described a narrow passage, walls damp with condensation, lit by buzzing fluorescent tubes. The deeper you went, the colder it got. Doors lined the walls, heavy steel doors with small rectangular windows. Behind each, a room barely large enough for a man to lie down. But those weren't cells. They were testing rooms. Doctors would come in, he whispered. Not prison doctors, outsiders. White coats, briefcases, talking in codes we didn't understand. They picked the inmates they wanted and we delivered them. Our job ended at the door. We never saw what happened inside, but sometimes we heard screams, begging, the kind of sounds that make your skin crawl. And then silence. The journalists pressed him. Why didn't you speak out? His answer was chilling, because anyone who asked too many questions ended up transferred, just like the inmates. And then you never saw them again either. The corridor unsealed. The rumor was that the corridor was breached during the 1971 riot. When inmates overpowered guards and seized control of large parts of Attica, they discovered the locked passage at the far edge of cell block D. For years, it had been dismissed as storage, a forgotten service route. But in the chaos, men pried it open. What they found inside sent shockwaves through the prison yard. One survivor, now an old man, recalled stepping into the darkness with a flashlight stolen from a guard. The beam revealed cracked walls streaked with brown stains, rusted chains dangling from hooks, and the skeletal remains of what looked like medical equipment. Metal chairs with restraints, broken monitors, glass vials scattered across the floor. It wasn't a corridor, he said softly. It was a tomb. The inmates dragged hostages inside to show them, forcing them to witness what lay hidden. Some officers swore it was propaganda, a scare tactic. But the terror in the hostages' eyes told another story. By the time state forces stormed the prison days later, the corridor had become infamous among inmates, a place not of rebellion but of revelation. Something the state desperately needed to cover up. Within weeks, contractors were hired. Walls were resealed. Records vanished. Official reports called it repairs due to riot damage. But the survivors knew better. The silent list. The journalists cross-referenced names from the Project Meridian list with prison records. What they discovered was horrifying. Dozens of men were logged as transferred to other New York facilities between 1972 and 1978. But when they contacted those prisons, there were no matching records. No files, no intake logs, no releases. It was as though those men had been erased. One inmate in particular stood out. Miguel Santiago, a Puerto Rican activist imprisoned for armed robbery. He wrote letters to his sister describing men in white coats, and his fear of being chosen for something he called the program. His last letter, smuggled out in 1975, read, "If you don't hear from me, it means they finally took me. Corridor D is not a myth. It's real. And once you go in, you don't come out." His sister never received another word. To this day, Santiago's file lists him as transferred. Transferred, but to nowhere. The family's anguish. For the families left behind, the corridor became a black hole. Mothers were told their sons had been moved. Wives were told not to visit until the men were settled. Some tried to sue the state, demanding information. Courts dismissed their cases for lack of evidence. One mother, interviewed in her Bronx apartment, held a faded photograph of her boy. "He was 19 when they locked him up," she said, tears filling her eyes. "He wrote me every week." Then the letters stopped. "I went to Attica, begged them to tell me where he was. They just said he'd been transferred. I asked where. They said they didn't know. How does a prison not know where they sent my son?" Her voice broke. "I'll die not knowing what they did to him." The storm of secrecy. By the late 1970s, the federal government had taken notice. Quiet investigations were launched, but every time evidence surfaced, it vanished into bureaucratic limbo. Files were sealed, subpoenas ignored. The journalists obtained one leaked memo between state officials. Corridor operations, must stress discretion. Negative publicity following 71 incident already compromised public trust. Any disclosures regarding supplemental programs could destabilize entire system. That line, supplemental programs, haunted them. What programs? Who authorized them? How many men had been lost? The state's refusal to answer only fueled suspicion. A survivor's nightmare. Perhaps the most disturbing testimony came from a man who survived Corridor D. His name was James "Jimmy" Holt. Arrested for burglary at age 22, he was sent to Attica in 1974. "They came for me at night," Holt recalled. 2 guards. No warning. Just dragged me out of my cell, blindfolded me, and walked me down a hall I'd never been before. When they took the blindfold off, I was strapped to a chair. Couldn't move my arms or legs. There were people around me, men in coats, not guards. One of them put a mask over my face. I smelled chemicals. I passed out. When he woke up, his body was bruised. Electrodes were taped to his chest. His head pounded. One man asked him questions, simple things at first. His name, his age. Then stranger ones. If you were given freedom, who would you kill first? If pain meant survival, how much could you endure? He refused to answer. The punishment was immediate. A surge of electricity ripped through his body. Holt claimed he was kept there for 3 days, subjected to a cycle of drugs, shocks, and questions. He lost all sense of time. On the 4th day, he was dumped back into his cell like garbage. No one believed me, he said bitterly. They said I was making it up. But after that, I had seizures for years. I still hear the buzzing of the lights when I try to sleep. His testimony, though terrifying, matched perfectly with the medical logs the journalists uncovered. Heart rate monitoring, psychological stress notes, even dosages of sedatives. Holt was one of the few who lived to tell the tale. The corridor's legacy. By the 1980s, Corridor D was officially sealed, its entrance bricked over. But whispers lingered. Guards still spoke of strange noises at night. Inmates swore the corridor was cursed. And families of the missing never stopped demanding answers. The state's official stance never changed. Corridor D does not exist. But the evidence, the files, the testimonies, the bodies that never returned, told a different story. A story of silence enforced not by steel bars but by fear. And the deeper the journalists dug, the clearer it became. The riot had not been the end of Attica's horrors. It had been the perfect cover. A massacre to distract from the truth. The truth that men had been experimented on, disappeared, erased. And at the heart of it all was that cold, narrow passage, the corridor of silence. As one journalist later wrote in his notes, Attica is remembered for the blood spilled in the yard. But its darkest secret lies not in the open, but behind a door most will never see. Corridor D was not a myth, was a machine. And like all machines built for silence, it still hums beneath the surface. The investigation had reached a point of no return. If they pursued it further, they would not just uncover a scandal. They would risk their lives. But the truth was out there, waiting in the shadows of Attica. And soon it would scream to be heard. Blood never dries. The journalists had pieced together fragments of a nightmare. Names erased from records, survivors whispering of experiments, and a corridor that officially didn't exist. But proof was still elusive. Testimonies could be dismissed as hearsay, files could be labeled forgeries, and families of the missing could be silenced by bureaucracy. What they needed was something undeniable, something that would shatter the wall of secrecy that had stood since 1971. And then came the tapes. The VHS tapes. They arrived in a plain cardboard box, left on the doorstep of one of the journalists' offices in Buffalo. Inside were 6 VHS cassettes, each labeled in black marker. Attica, Yard, and Corridor. No return address. No note. Just the tapes. When they loaded the first cassette into an old VCR, the screen filled with static, then sharpened into a grainy, blue-toned image. A timestamp read September 11, 71, 2:15 p.m. The footage was chaotic. Tear gas canisters rained down into the prison yard. Inmates staggered, blinded and coughing. Gunfire crackled from the walls above. Bodies collapsed into the mud. Floodlights cut through the smoke, illuminating figures running, falling, dying. The journalists sat in silence as they watched history unfold, not through news footage but through the cold, unfeeling eye of a surveillance camera. The riot, the massacre, the blood, it was all there, undeniable, raw. But the true horror came when they switched to the second tape. Corridor footage. The timestamp read September 14, 71, 4:07 a.m. That was a full day after the official retaking of the prison. By then, the state had declared the riot over. Order, they claimed, had been restored. Yet the footage showed something else entirely. A dim, narrow corridor. The same one survivors had described. Cracked concrete walls, rusted chains, shadows stretching in the harsh blue glow of fluorescent lights. The camera shook slightly as if hidden. A group of guards dragged a limp figure across the floor. The man was blindfolded, hands bound, his body covered in bruises. They hauled him into one of the side rooms and shut the heavy door behind them. Minutes later, muffled screams echoed through the corridor. The camera zoomed in just enough to catch the soundless horror, the man thrashing against restraints, the glint of needles, the movement of men in white coats. The journalists fast-forwarded, their stomachs twisting. The tape continued for hours. More men were dragged in. Some walked, others were carried. None came back out. At the very end of the footage, the camera lingered on a door at the far end of the corridor. Rusted metal, freshly welded, a faint dark stain seeping from beneath. The timestamp blinked steadily, September 20th, 71, 3:52 a.m. The riot had ended days before. But whatever was happening in the corridor hadn't stopped. The cover-up exposed. The journalists knew they had explosive evidence. They contacted forensic experts to analyze the tapes. Every detail, the timestamps, the camera angles, the distortion, was consistent with 1970s prison surveillance equipment. No signs of modern tampering. When they showed the footage to families of the missing, grief turned into rage. Mothers screamed at the screen, recognizing their sons being dragged down that hallway. One wife collapsed when she saw her husband's face, battered and swollen, moments before the door slammed shut. The state, when confronted, denied everything. Officials claimed the tapes were fabricated propaganda. But the denial crumbled when former guards, shown the footage privately, admitted it looked authentic. One even whispered, "That's the corridor. I swore I'd never see it again." The journalists had their proof. But proof alone doesn't always bring justice. In fact, it often brings danger. Threats in the dark. Within days of the tape's exposure, the journalists received threats. Anonymous phone calls. Cars parked outside their homes. Letters slipped under their doors reading, "Stop." One night, one of them returned to find his office ransacked. Files shredded, photographs stolen. But the tapes, they had hidden copies. Whoever was trying to silence them hadn't won. They realized then what they were up against. Attica wasn't just a prison scandal. It was a machine tied to state power, politics, and perhaps even federal programs nobody dared speak of. The corridor wasn't an accident, it was deliberate. And men had died to keep it secret. Blood in the yard, blood in the corridor. To understand Attica's true horror, you have to hold both images together. The chaos of the yard, where bullets tore through prisoners and hostages alike, and the silence of the corridor, where men disappeared into experiments. One was public, broadcast on television for the world to see. The other was hidden, buried in shadows and lies. Together they told a story not just of brutality but of betrayal. Because the men who died in the yard weren't just victims of riot control. They were cover. Cover for what was happening below. While the world debated who started the riot, who fired the first shots, and whether the governor should have negotiated, the real atrocity continued unnoticed. Corridor D was never about discipline. It was about control. Testing how far a man could be pushed before he broke. Measuring the limits of fear, pain, and silence. And when the riot erupted, it gave those running the corridor the perfect excuse to clean up their tracks.